Good evening and welcome to FOIA and FOIL Insight and Guidance during COVID-19 and beyond. The Deadline Club is very happy to have you here this evening. I'm George Bodarky, a proud Deadline Club board member and the news director of WFUV. That's an NPR affiliate station based in New York City. Now, this is a two-part event with one fantastic moderator and lots of Twitter handles. So if you're inspired to tweet throughout the evening, you'll find everyone's Twitter handles on the page you're viewing this on, as well as under the names of panelists on your screen. You also can post your questions to the screen that you're viewing this on as well, and we'll get to your questions throughout the evening. Now, let me introduce our moderator for the evening. She is Jeanmarie Evelly. She's the executive director at City Limits, where she joined the staff back in 2018 and previously served as youth program manager, reporter, deputy editor, and managing editor. Earlier on, she spent several years covering Queens for the hyperlocal news site DNA Info and reporting for community newspapers in the Bronx, including the award-winning Norwood News. So without further ado, let me introduce Jeanmarie. Jeanmarie, take it away.
Thank you, George. Thanks so much. I'm so excited to be here tonight and talk about records requests with you all. As George said, we are going to be talking in two sessions tonight, and I'd love to introduce our first two panelists. We're joined tonight by Gunita Singh, a legal fellow with the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press. Welcome, Gunita. And we are joined by Al-Amyn Sumar, counsel for the New York Times. Thank you guys so much for being with us tonight.
Thanks for having us.
Happy to be here.
Excellent. So obviously the pandemic has changed a lot of things about the way that we live and do business. It has made access to public information more important than ever in terms of people needing to listen to the news and get the news out. At the same time, the crisis has shuttered the offices of government agencies across the country, and it's interrupted many of the usual ways that reporters gather their information. So I wonder, generally, before we get into sort of the nitty-gritty details of FOIA, if you guys could talk a little bit about some of the biggest challenges you've seen reporters and those that you work with over the past year in terms of how the pandemic has just affected their general ability to do their jobs and do that news gathering.
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's the question of the hour. I think one of the main obstacles we've seen is agencies misunderstanding and misapplying laws like HIPAA and FERPA, which I know we're planning on getting into a bit more later. So I'm not going to go overboard lamenting about HIPAA and FERPA right now, but very briefly, those are laws that apply to patients and students respectively that protect their personal information from being disclosed to the public. But crucially, those laws don't apply to aggregate data or de-identified information like cumulative infections or deaths, which I think is precisely the primary data that journalists covering COVID-19 want when reporting about the toll that the pandemic has taken on our communities. But journalists so often haven't been able to get even that basic information from state health departments or even universities. With the effect that at various points throughout the last year, folks haven't had full comprehensive data about how the virus has been moving through our communities and our schools. So that's the main thing that stands out for me, but I'm definitely curious what Al-Amyn's perspective has been on the big obstacles that we've been facing.
I completely agree with everything Gunita said. And, another thing that we'll get into on the public records front is just like getting an answer to requests has become more challenging. Some agencies are not open, some of them are, but are understaffed. So that's been very difficult. But, on the news gathering front, like setting FOIA and FOIL aside, I think it's been a really difficult year. And I was thinking back to, a year ago, which seems like it was like a whole decade ago, and thinking about like what the early issues were that, our reporters were dealing with. And, some of it was that, they didn't even know that they could be outside on the street gathering information because of some of these, stay-at-home orders. So we had to kind of go into action and find out, well, for a given state where our reporter is, what do the laws say there about whether reporters can be on the street? And what kinds of steps should they be taking so that if they are kind of stopped by somebody, that they can show that they're, actually a reporter at the New York Times and, are properly out there in the course of their job gathering information. Another is privacy. And one way that that's played out is what Gunita points to is that, it's been harder to get access to information, but also just kind of, when reporters are out there in hospitals, in places where healthcare is being delivered, what are the kinds of things that they should be thinking about? And, there's a lot of misinformation about HIPAA, and, a lot of people saying, well, you can't even gather health information for people who are on the street willingly giving it to you because that's HIPAA information. Well, no. So there was, some educational work we had to do with our reporters to tell them, here's what HIPAA, requires, and here's what it doesn't require. And here are kind of privacy laws, again, very specific to the states that you might be operating in, that, you should be thinking about when you're out there gathering news. And like Gunita said, there has been, issues with access to public records. I think access to court proceedings we may get into this later, but that was a little bit different, and I think the pandemic may have actually increased access in some ways, in ways that I hope maybe continue on after the pandemic's over. But yeah, it's been a very difficult year, and I think a lot of different kinds of access issues all over the country, and in different parts of the world where New York Times reporters are based too.
Yeah, we're definitely going to talk about HIPAA, and we'll definitely talk about some of those maybe silver linings that have emerged over the last year in terms of access. We'll see them where we can. But yeah, I would love to hear from you, Gunita, about some of the things that RCFP has been tracking over the past year. I know you guys have been paying really close attention to the different ways that both the federal government and that local governments across the country have, many of them, altered their public records policies in light of the pandemic, citing this kind of emergency measure. Obviously, a lot of offices are closed and their staff is not working in their usual places. Can you tell us sort of what you guys have found over the past year, and how many of those measures and those kind of altered policies are still in place today, sort of generally? Are places starting to lift some of those?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. The Reporters Committee has been tracking modifications to public records laws for the past year. We started, right as folks started to quarantine, we've been tracking what states have been doing. And also we've been tracking what's happening at the federal level. So long story short, we've seen a wide spectrum of responses at both the federal and state level in terms of responding to requests for public records. So I'll just briefly tackle each in turn. And I'll start by stating the obvious, which is that Congress hasn't changed any of the federal FOIA's deadlines in response to COVID-19. But despite the fact that FOIA hasn't been amended during the pandemic, federal agencies have taken great liberties over the last 12 months in processing federal FOIA requests. Some agencies didn't really show any changes to their FOIA protocols. I recall seeing on Twitter, several journalists posting that they were regularly and timely getting their records productions from the Departments of Labor and Energy, for example. But other agencies, namely the FBI and the State Department, severely limited or suspended their FOIA operations. So this time last year, the FBI actually for about 3 weeks dismantled its electronic FOIA portal. And we're weirdly suggesting that we submit our FOIA requests by snail mail, which makes no sense because you'll recall that the Postal Service was under extreme strain at this time. It still is. The State Department also suspended its FOIA operations, claiming a 96% reduction in its ability to process FOIA requests. And both of those agencies claimed a need to reduce non-mission critical services, deeming FOIA non-mission critical, which was, of course, disappointing, not only to me, but all open government advocates and the journalists on this call right now. Fortunately, the State Department is up and running again, but the FBI's FOIA office is still only operating at 50% capacity right now, which is really slowing things down and exacerbating the delays that already hamper, the ability of the press and the public to get important records. But to shift to the state level, we've seen even more variety. We're seeing that modifications of state public records laws are still in place in at least 26 states. But, at the height of the pandemic, you asked about, what we're seeing now compared to several months ago. At the height of the pandemic, we saw that 2/3 of states plus DC were affected by restrictions on access. But fortunately, that number has decreased slightly. But just for a quick snapshot of what those restrictions look like, so in roughly 26 jurisdictions across the country, we're seeing states have either amended their laws to suspend or relax deadlines for responding to public records requests, which is the case in New Jersey and in Kentucky. Or governors have issued executive orders suspending or relaxing those processing deadlines, which is the case in Delaware, Rhode Island, and several other states. And most commonly, we're seeing individual state agencies have informed requesters that they'll either not respond to requests at all right now, or that processing will be delayed, it's currently the most common thing that we're seeing right now, including in New York, unfortunately. So that's the overview of how the pandemic has affected public records at the federal and state level.
Yeah, so quite a bit. And I would love to hear from you, Al-Amyn, about what you're seeing at the New York Times. I know reporters at the Times are always filing records requests, right? Did you change your strategy in the newsroom in light of some of these restrictions? Did you guys shift to like a COVID focused in terms of record requests? How did it sort of change your strategy for using these types of these filings?
Yeah, there was definitely a lot more interest in COVID, obviously, when the pandemic started. And so I think there was a big push to send requests, not just to sort of government health agencies, but to anyone who could have information about testing or cases. And in a lot of cases, that was universities. So we were dealing with a lot of universities, dealing with FERPA, HIPAA, those kinds of exemptions. So I don't think it changed the strategy so much as it just changed who we were asking for records and what kinds of issues we were focused on. In terms of kind of FOIA, successes or failures, we've had a few in the past year. Not all of them have been related to the pandemic. Some were kind of just cases that were filed before, or, as the kind of, things got back to normal a few months after the pandemic started, just other, things that reporters were still interested in. So in one case that we are still actually litigating now at the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, we sued the Indian Health Service for a report investigating a pediatrician's sexual abuse of children. He worked for the IHS. I believe he was criminally prosecuted, but the IHS didn't want to hand over the report and said that it was covered by an exemption for the quality of sort of medical care. Like if you have a report that reviews the quality of medical care, that kind of thing can be exempt from FOIA. This is not at all what that report is. So we won at the district court and we're now litigating that on appeal. We had another case involving the Department of Defense where we were looking for President Trump had changed the guidelines that apply when the US government deploys lethal force outside of traditional war zones. And it's actually very hard to litigate these cases because they involve classified information. And so you're usually looking for some evidence that the government has waived, its ability to invoke an exemption through statements in the public record to the media, things like that. So we have a limited victory there, but a lot of litigation ahead of us. But the one, pandemic-related victory, which was a really big one, was a case where we were suing the CDC for certain kinds of data that reflected kind of racial disparities in how the coronavirus had affected the United States. And we were very lucky. We got the data very quickly through litigation, which is unusual. And it's because we were lucky to get Judge Rakoff in the Southern District, who is an unusual judge in a lot of ways, but one of the ways he's unusual is just he accelerates the process for cases that he's involved in. And so I think this is done by my colleagues, not me, I can't take any credit for it, but within weeks of filing the case, we had this data. It was a huge amount of data. It ended up producing a front page story. So, I think one of the lessons there is just litigation can take a long time, but if you pull the right judge, things can go your way. We try not to promise to reporters that they'll be able to have a front page story within 2 months or within a few weeks, but you can catch lucky breaks like that. And one other tactic I think, which is worth mentioning, which we've used once in the pandemic, and we've done it before in other in sort of very rare cases too, but sometimes when you bring a FOIA suit, you can move for preliminary injunctive relief right at the beginning of the case, where you say, this is a really urgent request and the court needs to act on it right away, get the agency to respond and produce records right away, because this information is going to be valuable much more today than it will be later. We're going to talk about expedited processing later, but that's the kind of thing that, in a case like a pandemic or in a presidential impeachment, which is the one other time we've used it recently, we can credibly tell the court that this is not a case like any other. This information really does need to be out there right now. And the case we're using it right now, it hasn't been decided yet. We're litigating over vaccine data, but we'll see how it turns out.
Interesting. Yeah, and we'll definitely talk about ways to speed things up. That was actually going to be my next question. So I'm glad you asked about that. Obviously, the pandemic has slowed down a lot of processes, right? And I know that a lot of reporters are seeing their requests take longer to get answers to, or responses in general. What have you guys seen in terms of that? And is there any advice you would give for journalists who maybe they put out a request and the agency that they filed with is kind of ignoring their deadline or saying it's going to take much longer than reporting sort of warrants and needs?
Yeah, this is so the Reporters Committee, for context, has a hotline staffed 7 days a week by Reporters Committee attorneys. And part of what I do as the legal fellow focused on public records issues is I'm the one communicating with journalists about their FOIA and their FOIA questions when they call into our hotline. And I would say the most common question that we get is, how do I address delay, right? It's been months upon months since I submitted my federal FOIA request or state public records request, and I still haven't got a determination. And because it's such a common question, I'm actually going to pop in the chat. If I put it in the chat, all of the attendees will see it, right? Even though I can't see the attendees. All right, I'll pop it in the chat and see what happens. But we compiled some best practices, so I'm definitely going to put that in the chat for folks to take advantage of. But one thing I'll just say right off the bat is the federal FOIA was amended in 2007 to require agencies to have information on EDCs, that's estimated dates of completion. So I absolutely encourage requesters to regularly ping agencies for those EDCs. It's obviously not guaranteed to secure that quicker turnaround that I know you all need, but I feel like there's really never a downside to keeping that kind of pressure on the agency and just reminding them that you're there waiting and taking FOIA's deadlines seriously. And so maybe, they should consider doing the same. But definitely, Al-Amyn, let's hear your perspective on compliance with deadlines.
Well, I have to say the Reporters Committee has kind of the best resources around. So anytime I'm in a state that I'm not familiar with, or I want to see, what the latest development is, I go to their website and, everything is there. I was using it today, actually, for a couple of states. They're open government guides, which are really good, concise explanations of public record statutes. But the first thing I would do is kind of check what's happening in the state that you're in. This is not that hard to do if you use the Reporters Committee website, but especially during the pandemic, if it's a state where the government has basically said, we're not processing any FOIA requests, or there's no deadline until further notice, that's very different than, a place where a state has said, let's just give agencies a little bit more leniency, or we're going to, extend deadlines by a certain number of days. And that's important because you want to know how far you can push the agency, right? If it's a place where there are no deadlines anymore, then you throw in like a hot email and say, I demand that these things be produced now. It's been 2 months. Well, no one's paying attention to you because there are no deadlines anymore. So it's just important to know kind of what the ground rules are before you get into, before you start making any claims or get into kind of an exchange about, the date of completion of your request. But I think the biggest thing, honestly, and this has kind of been a pre-pandemic thing, and I think it still works in the pandemic, is just to pick up the phone and call these people. They don't often get called. Sometimes they're very surprised that they get called. Even today, I was talking to someone from a university in Texas. She was like kind of surprised that I called, and I think a little bit taken aback. But then, we talked, and she actually was able to answer my question right away. And I think it's just really important to remember that these people are human beings. Often the reporters come to me and they say, I haven't gotten an answer in 3 months. I feel like these people are hiding something. And sometimes they are, but the person who is sending the emails to you is usually like a low-level person, and they're not bad people. They're not unreasonable people. And so when you pick up the phone and you express a little sympathy for how the pandemic has like created a lot of backlog for the agency and how you understand that. And you're really just looking for a little bit of information on where your request stands and whether they can produce something. Can they do it in a rolling basis? They don't have to produce everything tomorrow, but maybe they can produce a tranche within a few weeks. Be creative with these people, but also just treat them as like, human beings. I think that's been very effective. It doesn't mean that you're going to get your records right away, but I think sometimes it can get you the answer to your question right away. So, the thing I was talking to this woman about this morning was, we put in a request for certain documents, and we suspected the university, when they said they had no responsive records, was not actually saying, we don't have this information at all anywhere, but we don't consider this information responsive to your request, which is a very different thing. And I had to kind of suss that out with her on the phone, to just say, are you taking the position that you have the information, but you don't think it falls under the, public records statute, or you just don't have it anywhere? And she was able to tell me, give me a straightforward answer when we talked on the phone. So, when you talk on the phone, it's just harder for people to ignore you. It's easier for you to come across as a human being and build a little bit of a relationship with them. I call this FOIA diplomacy, and I recommend it to a lot of people. But I think that's a really good thing to try. In the early days of the pandemic, it was hard because people weren't at their desks and they weren't answering phones. But I think people are starting to come back now. So it's definitely worth trying. It's not always going to work. It's not necessarily going to get you the documents right away, but it will not make things worse for you and may even get you some information that's helpful.
That's great. I love FOIA diplomacy. That's such a good term. And I think making an extra phone call is never bad reporting advice, kind of applied to anything in journalism. I mean, in talking just a quick follow-up on delays, you mentioned earlier the idea of expedited processing. What exactly is that? And like, where in the FOIA process does that happen? And are there ways you would recommend like journalists maybe could successfully argue for that? I don't know who wants to speak on that first.
I actually was going to say Gunita should speak first because she knows the law much better than I do.
I'm happy to, but I want to hear your perspective and how the Times has navigated expedited processing as well. I'm going to pop another FOIA wiki link in the chat. I can't tout the FOIA wiki enough. It really is the North Star, my North Star for navigating the federal FOIA process. But as discussed in the expedited processing section of the FOIA wiki, the legal standard basically asks whether the request, your federal FOIA request, demonstrates a compelling need for the records, and whether there is a compelling need rests on one of two things, or both. Whether failure to obtain the requested records on an expedited basis would reasonably be expected to harm someone, harm someone's life or their safety, or with respect to a request made by someone primarily engaged in disseminating information, so most of the folks on this call, is there an urgency to inform the public concerning some ongoing federal government activity? So expedited processing is very rarely granted under the federal FOIA. So in terms of expectation setting, which I think is a key part of why we're doing this webinar, even though everyone here is no doubt engaged in really important reporting, oftentimes with a genuine degree of urgency, it is pretty rare that it's going to qualify for expedited processing under FOIA, just because it's such an exacting standard. But I'll note, as you continue to report on COVID-19, for example, I think reporting on that subject in particular is really a prime candidate for expedited processing in ways that equally important, but maybe less urgent stories may not be. But by all means, Al-Amyn, if you have, stories of successfully getting expedited, I don't. So that's why I can't offer personal anecdotes about it.
I have had some very rare cases where it's worked. I'm not actually sure if it's helped the process, but it should. Just to give a bit of context, the way that most federal agencies process requests is they have three streams or queues. One is what they call simple requests, which usually are straightforward things for certain items that they expend less than a certain number of hours trying to track down. It's hard to get in the simple queue, but you want to be there because it's easier and you'll get your documents in a more timely fashion. Then there's kind of complex, and that's where a lot of things end up because requests are very broad. The agency doesn't know exactly what you're asking for, and it entails more than a few hours of work. And then there's a third queue for expedited processing. And that can really, really be helpful because you skip all of those folks who are in the complex queue. And like Gunita said, it's really hard to get, but it has happened. I've seen it. And I think the problem for our reporters time and again is that they don't spend a lot of time on the part of their request where they're requesting expedited processing. So usually they will just parrot the language of the regulations and say, this involves there's an urgent need here to inform the public of a federal government activity. But they don't actually say anything more than that. And I think if you take an extra 5 minutes to just explain that, because if you're, again, look at it from the perspective of a FOIA officer, you have this journalist from the New York Times. Obviously, they think their reporting is very important, but they haven't actually told you why. Why is it urgent? Why does it need to be, released today? And if you just spend a few minutes doing that, you'll stand out from most other requests. And I think the most helpful tip is in making the point that there is some urgency, tie your request, tie the information in there to something concrete that's happening in the near future. So, if you're looking for, records about something that's going to come before Congress potentially, like, say it relates to Section 230 in some way or the tech industry, don't just say, well, the public is now debating these issues and it's really important that, information about this be released. Say, oh, actually, there's a congressional hearing happening in 2 months. And it would be really useful for the purpose of that hearing that these documents come out and inform the public debate. That's when I've seen things be the most effective, is when there's some concrete thing happening in the near future that relates to your request and you can credibly say, this would really help that debate. But it is very hard to do. And I know that there's an appeals process if you want to challenge an agency's determination. That usually is hard to do too. But again, I think the 5 minutes it takes to put it in your request and have a few sentences on it is really worth it, because if you do get it, it could be very helpful.
Great. And while we're on the topic of denials, I would love to ask you guys, we mentioned it a few times, it's obviously something that comes up a lot when you're dealing with getting information related to health and medical care, which has been a big deal over the past year. So HIPAA and other privacy laws. I think that we're probably hearing a lot of records requests turned down with agencies invoking this idea of privacy. What have you guys seen with that? And are there exceptions to HIPAA, to other privacy laws that have been used a lot during this time to kind of reject information requests? And what are those exceptions?
Yeah, I haven't been so involved in FERPA issues, but I've seen a lot of HIPAA come up during the pandemic. And, I remember this early on, last year, really basic information about the pandemic was being denied to people on the grounds that it was protected by HIPAA. There were some cases where it was like, the name of the patient or, the address of the patient, that's protected information. Of course it is. But the New York Times is not interested in where people live. They wanted to know, where are the outbreaks happening? Are they happening in nursing homes, meatpacking plants? How many cases are in a particular city versus just a county? And that was, being shielded under HIPAA. And, Gunita can tell you this too, but in a lot of these cases, HIPAA just actually doesn't apply to that kind of information. The most important provision, I think, when it comes to public records requests is this required by law exception in HIPAA. And when we talk about HIPAA in this way, we're really talking about a set of regulations called the privacy rule, which were promulgated under HIPAA. HIPAA is this big, broad law enacted in '96. The privacy rule is a set of regulations that come out in 2000, I think. And basically what this required by law exception means is that HIPAA is not an exception to public record statutes. So if a public record statute, as virtually all do, come with the presumption that public records have to be disclosed, it is a legal requirement that the records be disclosed. Well, HIPAA is no obstacle to get to that. If there is some kind of exemption under state law that protects the information, well, then HIPAA applies to that too. And in some states, there are kind of provisions specific to healthcare information, but in most places, it's a privacy exemption that applies. And the balancing is like the public interest in the information versus the privacy interest at stake. So HIPAA really isn't adding anything to that. And also, Gunita can talk about this, but HIPAA has like a number of kind of threshold requirements too. And a lot of those weren't being met too in cases where agencies were saying that they apply. But my experience has been that, most of the time, and maybe I'm just an optimist, you're seeing that in my answers, but, people were not being really cynical and nefarious when they were invoking HIPAA. They just didn't understand, some of the stuff. And so when I've tried to educate, agencies and local officials about it and saying, here's all the reasons why this information isn't covered, they've actually come back and, just provided it most of the time. So I think there's a lot of educational work to do about something like HIPAA. State and local agencies know that it's a law that applies to healthcare information, and there are super steep penalties if you violate it. So they don't want to risk it. But if you tell them, actually, here's why you're not violating HIPAA, then I think they've come around. That's been my experience.
Great. And Gunita, do you have anything to add on HIPAA or tips for pushing back against that being used as a reason to withhold?
Yeah, not too much more to add. I think that's a really great description. I'll just add one other exception to HIPAA's privacy rule. Allows covered entities to disclose even protected health information if it's necessary to prevent or lessen a serious threat to public health or safety. That exception isn't as commonly invoked as the public records exception that Al-Amyn just described. But, I would note that as representatives of the news media who are in a position to educate people about the scope of the pandemic's toll, and my news consumption has just risen astronomically during the pandemic, in no small part just to help make informed decisions and educated choices about how to navigate even everyday decisions. And so I would definitely encourage representatives of the news media to rely on that exception as well. And just as support for the basis for that exception, I'll note that the Iowa Attorney General's office actually said that disclosures about positive cases of COVID to the media are helpful in reducing the spread of the virus. So all of that information, if you want to invoke it, if you're still running into HIPAA trouble, because I agree with Al-Amyn, at the very beginning of the pandemic, agencies were just invoking HIPAA left and right. I honestly, I think because they just didn't understand, there was a lot of confusion. But we're seeing fewer and fewer questions from journalists, at least on the Reporters Committee hotline. I don't know what other media lawyers or folks in this space are fielding, but I think there's been a lot of illumination about the scope of HIPAA over the last several months. But to the extent you're still running into those problems, the Reporters Committee does have a guide. We compiled the guide precisely for navigating HIPAA during the COVID-19 pandemic. I will put that in the chat momentarily.
That's great. Excellent. And I know that you mentioned earlier, Al-Amyn, that going to court over rejections, right, or denials, something that obviously the Times seems to do quite a bit. What kind of goes into the decisions that you make in terms of which requests to sue over? And do either of you have any advice for journalists who maybe don't have an institution, potentially freelancers or people who work for smaller outlets that don't kind of have that backing to head to court? Obviously, that's an expensive and time-consuming endeavor.
Yeah, on that point, I will say there is an outfit called the Gumshoe Group, which some of the audience may have heard of, that basically what they do is they're kind of a middleman between freelance journalists and lawyers who are willing to take on FOIA cases. So if you're a freelance journalist and you have a FOIA request that you want to sue over, I think the way it works is you go to them, they kind of vet it, and then they'll pitch that request to lawyers. And the reason it's kind of tempting for lawyers is because there are, apart from the fact that we care about public records and government transparency, is that you can get attorney's fees. So I know of a number of journalists who have gotten help through that, who have found good lawyers, and young lawyers are often especially eager to help because they're full of energy, and they can get court experience through these kinds of cases. So certainly look at them; they're doing good work. And on the question about what we think about, it really depends on the case. We don't bring cases to court unless we think we have kind of a good legal grounds, obviously, for getting the documents. And we wait for reporters to come to us and to kind of pitch us on it, because as you say, we do file a lot of cases. We don't have a ton of bandwidth. And so often we'll have the reporter and the editor come and kind of pitch us on it and tell us that this is not just important and newsworthy today, but is it something that, in 6 months, 12 months, maybe 2 years, when we actually get the documents, is something you're going to care about? Because we try to avoid situations where there's something really hot in the news, the reporter wants to sue, but it's not going to be relevant by the time we actually get the documents. And we do take stands on principle. Sometimes there are things that we really care about. I was talking earlier about classified information and how difficult it is to get that kind of information from the government absent some kind of public disclosure. So those are cases that we often lose, but we continue to bring because we think it's really important we don't think the law is very good, and we think it's important for the public to get that kind of information. So it really is a mixture of considerations, but I think a key one is just, letting people know that, hey, we're going to file the lawsuit today, it's going to get pressed, but we're actually not going to get anything probably for many months or years. Are you comfortable with that? And that's often a huge consideration.
Interesting. Gunita, did you have anything to add, or any advice for journalists who are getting repeated denials or can't seem to get past that and are considering maybe some kind of legal action?
Yeah, going back to our earlier conversation of delays, sometimes the only thing you can do is sue. Sometimes the threat of litigation, in addition to litigation itself, is the only thing that's going to prompt the agency to actually comply with its statutory deadlines, whether it's a state public records request or the federal FOIA. In terms of general tips, I think that exhausting all of your administrative remedies really can help build a robust record so that when you do get to court, the court sees, okay, this person did everything in their power to try to get those records in a timely fashion, and the agency still didn't comply. So one thing I will note, prior to advancing litigation, under both the federal FOIA and the New York Freedom of Information Law, a delay actually constitutes a constructive denial, such that you can administratively appeal the agency's failure to timely respond to your request. So if litigation is in the back of your mind, make sure you tick off that box as well and file an administrative appeal, because it's just one more thing that the court will see to kind of, build some sympathy for your case. You've been waiting however many months for that request, or for that record rather, and the agency still hasn't complied. So that's just a practical tip. But I also want to give another plug to Gumshoe Group. They're doing really great work connecting records requesters, particularly freelancers with media lawyers who really do have that hunger to fight for government transparency. So I'm glad that you brought them up, Al-Amyn.
Yeah, that's great. I hadn't heard of them. That's really interesting. I know we only have a couple of minutes yet left before we break and take a break for our second session. But I would love to, I know we mentioned it earlier, in addition to freedom of information requests, I would love to hear what you both think about how open meeting laws have sort of progressed over the past pandemic. Obviously, we can't meet in person the way we normally would. Government agencies, public hearings, things like that, all of that has sort of been transitioning to events like this virtually. I think that's been good in some ways for access, but bad in other ways for access. And I wonder if you could both talk about sort of what you've seen on both sides of that fence.
Sure. I have had less experience with kind of public meetings, but a lot more with court hearings. And I think that you're exactly right, Jeanmarie, that it's been good in a lot of ways, because reporters now have access to a lot more hearings than they used to, all over the country, sometimes by phone, sometimes by video. And, I really hope that that's something that continues after the pandemic. It's just so easy to do and so helpful. I've seen a couple kind of issues that have come up though. One is that, sometimes there just isn't a remote access to a hearing. And this is kind of more later in the pandemic when courts started having in-person hearings again. So they would have an in-person hearing, but they wouldn't have any remote access. And it'd be really difficult for a reporter to get to, let's say, Georgia, where there is a hearing happening about some attempt to overturn the election, because our reporter, even if he got there, he would have to quarantine for a certain number of days in Georgia. And so you just couldn't attend the hearing, like it would be impossible to do. So there have been cases like that. And another has been just like, sometimes failing to follow court rules when you're on a remote hearing. So there was an issue, I think, 1 or 2 months in the pandemic at a court hearing in Michigan, where the reporters took a screenshot of the virtual hearing and they weren't supposed to, and the judge found out and he was very mad. So I think there's just like, some oversight of specific rules that apply in some of these contexts, and it's just worth paying attention to things like that. But I think the general trend, as you said, has been a good one.
Yeah, I totally agree. Some violations of open meetings laws during the pandemic have certainly occurred, but I totally agree. I really think by and large, states and municipalities have really attempted to leverage technology to facilitate the spirit that undergirds open meetings laws and open government. In some cases, it's been really simple to ensure that there are still avenues for public access with everything going remote, whether it's the raise hand function on Zoom or posting dial-ins that folks can call into. I'll note that on occasion, there have been secret meetings about pandemic responses where government bodies didn't provide that statutorily mandated notice. We've noted that that's happened in Maine and Tennessee, for example. We've also seen technical difficulties during, Zoom government meetings that have happened in Maryland and Texas. and several other jurisdictions. And of course, even those minor glitches can impede easy access by the public to government meetings. But on the whole, I really think we've seen a lot of positive developments, both on the open meetings front, but also on the court access front, where dial-ins and Zoom hearings have become so ubiquitous. And I really hope that those developments are going to stick around even after we, emerge from the pandemic, because it's really been wonderful to see those extra avenues for openness and access that we just, for some reason, weren't taking advantage of before.
Yeah, it's really great when you can dial in from your living room, right, or your bedroom, rather than having to trek out to the courthouse. I think we also had a question, just to repeat the name of the organization that does the free or that helps set freelance journalists up with legal experts. It was the Gumshoe Club. Was that? Do I have that correct?
Gumshoe Group.
Gumshoe Group. Okay, great. The Gumshoe Group. Just for those that are wondering, if you're looking for some legal expertise and help with your freedom of information requests, check them out. Great. Well, thank you both so much. Is there anything else that you want to add, or any kind of final tips for folks as they are hopefully going to be reinvigorated after this event to file some additional records requests?
With delays having become such an endemic feature of the FOIA process, in the context of the pandemic and outside the context of the pandemic, I'm going to say something perhaps mildly controversial, but if you can avoid filing a FOIA request, try to. I love noting the helpfulness of FOIA reading rooms, because a lot of folks still don't know that they exist. But if you Google, whatever agency plus FOIA reading room, oftentimes you can see online what records requests have already been processed and what records have already been released. And agencies will post those online. And that can be a great way to see what's already out there without having to reinvent the wheel and deal with the stress of obstinate agencies and non-responsive agencies. So that's just one tip. And then the other tip is, please take advantage of the resources that the Reporters Committee has on its website, whether it be the Open Government Guide or the FOIA Wiki or the hotline. I will be the person you talk to if you have a FOIA or public records question, and I would be delighted to try to be of help.
Great.
Yeah, and I'll just reiterate that second point. Like, the Reporters Committee's resources are fantastic. FOIA Wiki is often my starting point when there's a piece of FOIA that I'm not super familiar with that's, at issue in a case. So there's just a ton of really good resources out there that can help you. And I wish you the best of luck.
Great. Well, thank you so much again. Once again, for those of you watching from home, that is Gunita Singh of the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, and Al-Amyn Sumar, counsel for the New York Times. We really appreciate you guys talking with us. We're going to take about a 10-minute break and reconvene with our panel of local New York reporters who are going to talk about their experiences with the state FOIA law. So if everyone wants to sign back, join us again at 7 o'clock. So we'll see you in 10 minutes. But thank you both for your great advice. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much.
Hi, and welcome back, everybody, to the second portion of tonight's panel about FOIA and FOIL in the age of COVID-19. I'm Jeanmarie Evelly with City Limits, and I would love to introduce our next group of panelists, some local New York journalists. So we're going to switch from talking about federal FOIA to New York State FOIL. And we'll start, we've got on hand tonight, we're joined by Bridget Bergen, the City Hall and Politics reporter for WNYC, Josefa Velasquez, the State Capitol reporter for the news site The City, Nolan Hicks, City Agencies and Politics reporter for the New York Post, and Gersh Kuntzman, editor-in-chief at Streets Blog NYC. Thank you guys for being here tonight. And I thought what we could start with first, I know all of you have written semi-recent, very successful stories based on freedom of information law requests. And I thought we could touch on each of those big stories, and maybe you could walk us through the process of what your records request was like. How long did it take to get the documents that helped you report this story? Did you have to appeal, do any sort of extraordinary measures to get an answer finally, and give us sort of the general basics, and then we'll move on to more kind of general FOIL related questions. So let's start with you, Josefa. I know that you had a story in July that was looking at civilian complaint reports for NYPD officers. And this was sort of part of this ongoing struggle to get these disciplinary records released by the NYPD as part of the repealing 50-1A law. And you, I think, got your documents in sort of a little window there where they were actually releasing them, and then a court order, because of a lawsuit that was ongoing at the time, had sort of clamped down on that access for a little while. So tell us how that story came about, and what was the process like to get those disciplinary records? It was for something like 250 police officers that your story looked at?
Yeah, thanks for having me. So in late May, this is in the midst of the protests that erupted after George Floyd's death, we got word that the legislature was considering repealing this decades-old law. And I think immediately as a newsroom, we just rushed together and said, okay, well, we've been waiting for these records for years. Some of us are older than or younger than this law, which was passed in like mid 70s, late 70s. What can we get and how quickly can we get it? And in the days that followed, we knew immediately that this law was going to be repealed and that the unions that represent police officers, corrections officers, were going to file a lawsuit, and that would be the end of the records release. So we really had this narrow window of maybe a week to try to get all of these records requests. So we just tried to be as broad as possible. And we all, I think there might've been 4 different bylines on that story. We all went to our sources, whether at the CCRB, the NYPD, the mayor's office, the state legislature, and basically asked everyone, what's going to happen? What records can we request? Who has this information, and how do we get access to it? So immediately we all knew that the CCRB, which is the Civilian Complaint Review Board that oversees the NYPD, had a lot of these records already digitized, and they've just been sitting in this internal database. So that would be the quickest way of getting it. So we said, okay, let's try to find the officers with the most complaints. We don't know what that looks like. We vaguely know what these reports detail, and had to ask, legal aid, different legal groups, what you guys have seen these records. How do we cater our FOIL request to make sure that it is broad enough to capture some of these, but also specific enough that we get something relatively soon? And I think that's why we were able to get records so quickly, was that we knew what we were looking for before we had ever actually filed the FOIL. And, I think we got them relatively soon because there was this window that was going to shut down the second that lawsuit was filed by the unions. So we didn't have to appeal, which was great. It came relatively quickly. I think it took a couple, maybe a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, something along those lines. It was really quick. And then after we got those records, within a matter of weeks, or I think as we got those records, ProPublica had this like treasure trove of all these complaints. NICLU took some time, but they released their full complaint data set. But we actually had the reports that underlie some of that information. But then that was it. That was the extent of everything we were able to get until, a couple of weeks ago when the lawsuit was finally settled. And now we're just waiting on the rest of those FOILs to come through that we filed back in June, July, sometime around then.
Have you heard anything on that front? So obviously, so you got some of the records in like a tiny burst, and then there's still more that you're hoping for?
Yeah, there's all these other records that we've requested. I think they've started to trickle out now. And we're supposed to be getting those responses sometime soon. I should check in on those, which is a good reminder. But after the courts lifted that stay, I think we're all sort of waiting for the floodgates to be opened and these databases to go online, which some of them already have, but trying to figure out like the nitty gritty of the underlying information of all of these different complaints.
Great. Well, I hope it happens as quickly as the last time for you. And now I'd love to hear from you, Bridget, about the piece that you did for WNYC about, this is an election-related story, about how some of the cultural institutions here in New York that receive city tax breaks, so places like the New York Historical Society, the Met, kind of turned down the city's request to serve as polling sites. And this was obviously a time when we had early voting in place. We were really looking for space to host that type of voting. What made you think of this story, and who did you go to for those records? It was for the BOE. How did you decide what to ask for?
So it's great to be here. Thanks, Jeanmarie. I do a lot of stories about elections. I had been following the rollout of early voting, which started in 2019. And, it was a really low turnout election. And so there had been this fight over how many sites the city would use and would they use schools. But ultimately, we didn't see anything like what we saw this past year, where there were these huge, massive lines, because there weren't those kinds of questions on the ballot. But after the first elections with early voting, I just went to a joint legislative hearing at 250 Broadway, and wanted to hear the testimony from the city and the State Board of Elections about the implementation of early voting. And during that testimony, the City Board of Elections Executive Director Mike Ryan, was asked multiple times about why they didn't have more sites and couldn't they get better sites. And he said, I have a stack of letters on my desk this thick of all the places we asked that said they wouldn't host, voting at their location. And so he couldn't get out of the room before I cut him off. And I was like, I would like to see those letters. And I submit a FOIL immediately to the Board of Elections. And in this particular case, it was, I think it was something they wanted people to look at. But that kind of was the first part of that story, because just getting those letters wasn't really enough, because it was like, okay, so who cares that, the Met Museum says it would be, an impossible burden for them to open up their massive facility for a tiny space for people to vote. What is the impact of that? So then we looked at all of the organizations that had said no and how much they get in tax breaks from the city, specifically property taxes. And it totaled to $500 million. And so then it was like, okay, well, not only are you getting this huge, incentive from the city to do what is your mission, now it's time for you to, maybe do your civic duty. And that was kind of taking the records and then using it to tell sort of the rest of the story. And what then sort of became very clear was come this past election, because we already knew there was going to be a shortage of early voting sites. Then when we started to see these huge lines, we kind of were able to look at, oh, well, look at all of these places that hadn't stepped up. Like, you wouldn't have had to have 120,000 people assigned to one site on the Upper East Side had some of these other organizations stepped up. So getting the records was kind of the first step, and that story was the first step, but then we were able to build on it and continue to watch the election through that lens and through this sort of this view of, early voting equity, so to speak, for the rest of 2020. So that's what we did.
Yeah, it's a great story. I wonder if those institutions will be opening their doors in June and November.
After we did our story, the Lincoln Center added a poll site. So
excellent.
There's one.
Well done. Nolan, I would love to hear from you about the reporting that you've done with NYCHA and lead paint. Obviously, this has been a really ongoing scandal with NYCHA, and you specifically looked into health department inspection reports. What was the FOIL process like for you? And I'd also just love to hear how you handled and sort of decided to sort through that information, because I think your story said that you guys got something like more than 4,000 inspection reports.
So there were two dumps, and they ended up basically becoming two different stories. One was the 4,500 pages of inspection results from all of the apartments, but they refused to tell us where the apartments were, so we sort of had to hand assemble it by going to bunch of different places and trying to collect all the known positive cases of lead poisoning in public housing, and then match sort of the dates and times of that back to the reports that we got. So it was a gruesome process in terms of the FOIL. There were a bunch of FOILs that got filed, they got consolidated. There were a bunch of negotiations. For the first story, the health department fought us and a bunch of other news organizations for those records for months, and eventually coughed them up. These were the individual lead inspections, and for each of the apartments. And when you get back 4,500 pages worth of stuff, it's a little overwhelming, and then it just sort of you figure out, well, if I've just gotten 4,500 pages worth of stuff, and I know there are sick kids, I know there's a story sort of explaining how A gets to B in this mess somewhere, and then so you just sort of start going through it. You go through 5 or 10 reports and you try to figure out what's in each report. You try to figure out, you have all these different readings, what each of the different readings are, and you start taking guesses and stabs at kind of what feels out of the ordinary and what doesn't match the other things you're seeing and what doesn't, because the reports don't really have a ton of narrative language in them. There is sort of a giant summary of all of the so health inspect, basically just of it is, kid gets sick, health department is notified, the kid is tested with levels of lead that exceed the thresholds here in the city of New York. Health inspector is dispatched to the kid's apartment, whether it's public housing or in private housing. They take an X-ray gun to everything that looks like it could be deteriorated paint. And if the paint that they measure with the X-ray gun, exceeds certain readings, it's determined that lead in this area is in excess of what's allowed and is dangerous to the kid, and it either has to be repaired or removed. And so each one of those X-ray scans is an entry. Each apartment gets a report. Some apartments, I'm sorry, this is work being silly. Let me just turn this off real fast. Each apartment gets at least one report. And so it just sort of, you build from there. So you sort of organize a spreadsheet based on that. Well, you kind of know you have each, they don't give you the apartment numbers, but each file has a unique identifier to it. The unique identifier happens to be the case number. And then so you just sort of start building that way. And you go through 5 or 10 of the reports, you have an idea of what's important, what's not important, and you start digging around for people who know what should be in these reports, how they all get collected, what matters, what doesn't matter. And if I feel like going through that whole process, it sort of illustrated to me the most important piece of it was, sure, we got all the documentation, but we were also had the time to really find the experts. Like, we tracked down the original people who wrote the lead laws, and sort of did an entire story about how sort of the inspections process was sort of entirely flipped on its head, or sort of the lead remediation process was entirely flipped on its head by the Public Housing Authority, right? Like the onus under city law is for landlords to clean up the apartments. And yet what happened here was you had all these kids testing positive, and you had the health department, instead of protecting the kids, basically okay NYCHA, bringing in whomever to kind of collect samples or not collect samples and dispute the work of their own health department inspectors. And you had kids stuck in apartments that had lead in them. NYCHA contested it, and the kids were getting sicker, and the lead was staying in the apartments, right? So that was, you know, I feel like that the documents are great, but documents without people who know what they are and know what they mean and can explain them in really sort of common English ways to readers that don't amount to much. Like, you know, you have to be able to find it, and you have to be able to explain what it means, and you have to be able to sort of illustrate the people who are harmed when government goes sort of that askew, that wrong, you know, sort of screws up at that order of magnitude.
Yeah, that's absolutely. How long did it take you between getting that like document dump, the 4,500 pages, and then like to sort and to kind of find the cruise of the story that you wanted to tell?
It took a while. I know, so a bunch of us all got the documents at the same time because we got a phone call from the health department saying the records are here to come pick up. And we had to send someone to Long Island City to get the documents back on CDs, or they were going to mail them to us. And, you know, I was doing NYCHA stuff. Greg Smith was doing NYCHA stuff. The Times was doing NYCHA stuff. And the idea of waiting a week for records to somehow make their way from Long Island City to the newsroom so we could start working on it is the, you know, I mean, it's sort of the kiss of death in this town. So we started on the document. It's on the documents immediately, and it was just one of those things where it's just like this. Everybody basically got the same dump, but the scale of the dump was so sort of it was so huge that we sort of like, after 8 hours or 10 hours of going through it, and it was a late night, we just sort of gave up trying to write something that night and just sort of kept hacking away at it. But there were like 3 or 4 processes where we thought we found stuff, we take it to the experts, they walked us through what they thought it meant. And then they would say, well, did you check X, Y, and Z? And again, some of these reports for these apartments could be 30 or 40 or 50 pages, which is how you go, you know, get to 4,500 pages worth of paperwork. And then we would say, no, well, let's go check here. And then because we've already done 30 reports up until we got to that point when someone said, well, did you look at, you know, to take a 990, did you look at like, you know, line 27 of part 5 of section A or whatever, right? And you're like, no, but I'm going to go do it now. And then you go back and you have to do that for every report that you've already looked at, and then sort of come all the way back to where you were, right? So it was a very, it was an iterative process. There are like 8 versions of the spreadsheet floating around somewhere. And yeah, it was one of those things. It took months to get the records. I think it was 8 months to get the records. And then after we got the records, it took another 4 months to publish it, which with the timelines that tabloids normally work with is sort of extraordinary. That wasn't my only story over that point in time, but you know, it was something where I could take a couple hours a day and just sort of like 1 report, 2 reports. Well, we found a bunch more stuff, make another couple of phone calls, and it just sort of it's little pieces at a time, and eventually you get a coherent picture. And when you feel like you have the coherent picture, you publish.
Great. Thank you for walking us through that. And Gersh, let's hear from you about Streets Blog. You dug up some old MTA documents, right? Some old and some new, I think, in that story, relating to how the Transit Authority had rejected some earlier and cheaper proposals to put a pedestrian and bike path on the Verrazano Bridge, something that people are still pushing for and trying to get done today. What got you onto that story, and how did you know what to look for when you're talking about like a report that originally came out in 1997?
Yeah, well, a bike lane on the Verrazano Bridge is like the holy grail of Streets Blog readers right now. The 1997 report existed. Everybody knew about that. People had seen that report. It was a report that said it could be done relatively cheaply. but the MTA ignored that report, but finally agreed with activists that it should at least examine what it would take to build a bike and pedestrian path on the Verrazano Bridge. They decided that in around 2014. And they took a couple of years and they put their best engineering team on it, and they did focus groups. And then the resulting report was never released to the public. Now, I wouldn't have known that. Every once in a while, someone would mention it at an MTA board meeting. When are you going to release the report on the Verrazano bike path? And a bunch of the activists had really been pushing me to get that. So, literally like my second week at Streets Blog, I foiled for it because, why not? It's just the paperwork to file. Hey, can you give us that report? So it kind of connects to like what Nolan was saying. Like, you need an expert. Like, I would never have even known that report mattered. And sure enough, it comes back. And I was working with an expert to go through it. Again, a lot of it was engineering jargon. I never would have really understood the ramifications of each part of it, but only through really going through the original 1997 report and comparing it to what they considered and what they didn't even consider, I was able to come up with this story that they had not only rejected a very simple plan for a bike path on the Verrazano Bridge, which would have cost almost nothing and been able to be built immediately, and instead had their engineers come up with almost a $400 million plan. And they sent that $400 million plan through the focus groups. And obviously, even the cyclists in the focus groups were like, I wouldn't spend $400 million on a bike path on the Verrazano. Well, sure enough, they got the result they wanted. And that was in the report. And that's the reason they never released that report, was because they knew it was so absurd that they basically increased by 50-fold what a bike path would actually cost on the Verrazano Bridge. Because they knew that once we got that report, or once anybody got that report, they were going to look like they didn't really even consider it seriously. And in fact, they didn't. And so the result was that we got this, what looked to be like this great story. And it really was just the MTA just not wanting to consider a reasonable plan to help cyclists get from Staten Island to Brooklyn.
A lot of good lessons here. So use your experts, lean into those experts, lean into those sources, and chip away at it. Great. Well, I think you guys all cover kind of different areas of policy stuff. Some of you at the state level, some of you at the city level. I would just love to hear sort of, and I'll throw it out to the group generally, what you've seen in both areas in terms of the last year. So specifically during the COVID-19 pandemic, in the first half of the program tonight, we sort of talked about the different ways that the pandemic has slowed down the just kind of public access in general. Are there places where you guys have seen either at the state or the city level things done well in terms of handling access during this time? And then I would even more love to hear where you think that they have not done well and where the real problems have been during the past year. I mean, this could be in terms of like records request or just access generally, I think.
I mean, FOIL's become effectively useless. I've got FOILs that I filed 2 years before the pandemic that are now being delayed because of the pandemic. It's I don't think I've ever seen a records log gutted in quite the same. I mean, like effectively gutted, right? Because it's just extended and extended and extended and extended and extended. Sort of the flip side of that is there's been real shifts in sort of like everyone's sort of chasing after the same thing. So there is so much attention focused on an issue that you can sometimes compel agencies outside of FOIL, basically just with the bully pulpit, into releasing data, into releasing information. Eventually, like it's ugly. It takes a lot of yelling at the mayor at a press conference a lot. And the Cuomo people too sometimes bend if you like make the same inquiry enough times and start writing stories about how they're not releasing it. But like, things like the I mean, it was just it's been really starkly serious stuff throughout the entirety of the pandemic that they've just refused to sort of own up or discuss or release in anything approaching a timely manner, like the contracts for the mobile morgues in the city and how many bodies are being held there. The city, I don't think, ever held an official briefing about that. The mayor refused to talk about it because he gets visibly squeamish talking about death. And like eventually it sort of leaks out in dribs and drabs, and we eventually get it. And it's, you know, giant docks full of refrigerated trucks on the Brooklyn waterfront. So, you know, our photographers are shooting it. But that to me, I think sort of like encapsulates just how bizarre and broken the dynamics of open government got in the course of this whole thing, where people wouldn't even own up to our inability to handle the number of people who died in this awful mess and how we were handling their bodies.
Yeah, wow.
Got an example that'll help. So I've been very eager to figure out how many driver's licenses get suspended every year by the Department of Motor Vehicles, because on their website, there's a whole list of reasons why your license would get suspended. Maybe you go through, you get too many ticket points, et cetera, or you don't pay your tickets, whatever. So I just initially just asked the press office, how many driver's licenses did you suspend in the last 12 months or in the last calendar year, whichever is easier for you? And they, for 6 months, wouldn't even answer the question. And then finally said, you have to FOIL that. So I FOILed it and rejected the FOIL, claiming they don't know. And so then I showed that to a lawyer, because I said that cannot simply be possible, that the agency that hands out the driver's license and indeed suspends them and indeed tells you the requirements for not getting your license suspended wouldn't know how many licenses suspended. So we filed the FOIL, they rejected it. And it turns out the lawyer said, well, you can't ask them how many licenses were suspended. You have to ask them how many license events occurred during the 12-month period. So the term of art was license events, a term that doesn't appear on any of their websites, a term that the press office didn't give me when I asked them for the information. So like, how would I know that? So I literally had to hire a lawyer to write the FOIL request, and the FOIL law exists so that the public can get information. You know, it's just absurd. License event. So don't get your license evented.
Wow. So I think a good lesson here too is, again, like, use those lawyers if you can find them, because you need those. Yeah, that's really incredible. Just ever, Bridget, do you guys have any thoughts on sort of what you've seen in the past year specifically, either around records requests or just that sort of general access and transparency?
So I think, and Nolan had mentioned it, like anyone who covers the Cuomo administration or has filed a FOIL request for the Cuomo administration, that request you will not get back this calendar year, or maybe even next calendar year. So the bar is in the basement. It is underground below the subway. So when the pandemic started, the excuse was, and we're in a pandemic, we can't fulfill these requests. We're just going to keep extending them. But at some point, once you cross the 2-year threshold, an extension is just like laughable. And that really hasn't changed. And I think you do need the bully pulpit to apply pressure to get some of these records released. I mean, I think the best example of this is what Bill Hammond at the Empire Center has done with the nursing home data request. And really, we did not see any movement on the true number of nursing home deaths until the Attorney General put out her office's report saying, well, the number of people who died in nursing homes is actually far greater than what the Cuomo administration reported, because there was an undercount. And it wasn't until that moment where another office had to get involved where we started to see the ball rolling and getting information on that. But I mean, I've had FOIL requests into the state health department or the governor's office that have just languished for years. Like, I have grown older, there are wrinkles, there's things happening there that like really are wild. And I'm very jealous of like colleagues in Florida who are like, yeah, I can FOIL for text messages. And I'm like, how do you get them back so quickly? But I think over the last year, you've seen a lot of agencies rely on the pandemic excuse to not fulfill these requests when they weren't fulfilling them to begin with. Hopefully that'll get better, but I doubt it. But there are some few bright spots where, you know, once you know what to look for, and then there are like, you can hit different like agencies against each other, different administrations against each other. So one, let's say the de Blasio administration releases like a certain snippet of information, you use that to file another FOIL against their FOIL administration, tell them, hey, I got this information from them. How come I don't have this from your side of the equation? And I think that has helped, but it is applying pressure and then just like waiting and anticipating for disappointment.
I like the pit the administrations against each other to get some of that get some of that information out. Bridget, any thoughts that you want to share about what you've seen?
Yeah, I mean, I think similar to what Giuseppe was saying, anytime you have a city-state dynamic that you can use to your advantage, it helps. With elections, it helps with the city and the state board because they have different information, and you can often use the information you get from one to get more information from the other. But I think that the larger point is there is really a crisis in New York in terms of accessing what should be public information, and that FOILs that get filed, that get extended, that then just drop off. I mean, when you have turnover with new lawyers who come into agencies, like then it's really like you've entered the black box, and suddenly it's like it's almost like you're starting over, even though you've already had these things filed. But this like transition period is, and so I think it's worrisome. It would be a great issue for maybe it would be a great issue for somebody to take up who has the power to change it. But at this point, I think it becomes it's like the persistent fight and finding people who then will leak you the information that you should otherwise have access to.
Like PTA change orders, they're voting on things, they don't put the change order to the board. There's maybe a brief verbal description of what the change order does. I put in a records request for change orders for 3 years ago. This is a story we did about the tile and the tunnels, and I got documents back. I got none of the change orders, which is actually what the FOIL was about. And it took 3 years, right? Like a change order is not a state secret. It's a one-page description of we're doing X instead of Y, and here's the price tag, you know? And coming and having covered government in Texas, we're like literally change orders above a certain, forget contracts, change orders above a certain amount are coming to the city council and are posted 48 hours ahead of time. And it's like, just that all of this just exists in this impenetrable thing. It's nuts. It's bad for governance, really.
But that would never change in New York. I hate to be a pessimist, but you would need a politician who runs for office actually seeking transparency, which does not serve, they believe it does not serve their interest, because they're the ones whose transparency is going to reveal something they don't want you to see. So,
well, I mean, de Blasio ran,
promised,
right? I mean, de Blasio ran and he promised to be the most transparent mayor in the city's history. And there are a grand total, I think there are a grand total of 3 attorneys in the mayor's office handling FOIL cases, which is one reason why the backlog there is so ridiculously long. I mean, forget the law is not great in New York to begin with, but there are things directly in the mayor's control he could fix. And he doesn't. He could hire more attorneys and put them in the FOIL office. He doesn't. He could say, we won't object. Like, anytime they withhold information, they're filing that objection because they don't want it to be released. The onus is on them to apply the exemption. And they do it in every case. Like, they've created, sort of this impenetrable thing, and then they sort of use it to defend themselves against fixing it.
I mean, state law isn't great though either. Or maybe it's city law. I don't know, because sometimes I'll FOIL for internal communications inside an agency, what the head of the bike division is saying to the commissioner.
That's state law.
That's state law. Okay, but so they say, well, you can't see internal communications.
Yeah.
Well, why? Who created that law?
Considering how much of kind of a slog this can be, right? We've mentioned years-long waits. how do you guys kind of work that into your reporting process? And do you, I know Gersh is an editor, so maybe you can say what you prefer your reporters to do, but those of you who are sort of pitching ideas to editors, do you mention like, I want a foil for this? Do you kind of do it on your own? Do you ever need to kind of convince an editor to kind of buy into the time and the process that it'll take for these stories? Or do you kind of pursue the records requests first and then see what you get? Or how do you kind of do that? And work that in? And any advice for reporters who might be looking to do more records requests, but maybe would have an editor who would say, listen, it's going to take too long. I don't know if it's worth it.
I don't think you can really pitch unless it's something that you know everyone is pursuing or like is something that's clearly like public. Like I think it's hard to pitch a story until you've seen some of the records to understand what the story is. Particularly if like if it's not something that's like on a beat, or like if you are trying to convince an editor to let you block out X amount of time, but you're at the foil stage, well, you don't really, it might be too early to do that. Like file millions of foils, and then as you start to get some responses, you'll figure out what the stories are.
Sometimes a reporter will pitch me, I want to do a foil on whatever. I'm like, of course. But sometimes something will come back that's really a tiny little incremental movement on a story, but that's fine too. I never have a problem with a reporter just saying, hey, we foiled for the cost of this security fence, and here is what it turned out,
So it sounds like get those record requests out there and then kind of see what you get and just always have some coals on the fire, it sounds like. What about folks who might be, I know this probably isn't the most, what we've heard, encouraging conversation to encourage people to file more records requests. For people who might be like intimidated by them or discouraged by the concept or the idea of having to wait a long time, what would you say to journalists or even members of the public? You don't have to be a journalist, obviously, to file a records request. Anyone can do it. What would you say to folks who might be hesitant because they might think that it won't yield them anything or it's not worth the effort?
So I think you'll never get anything back, or you'll never get any responses if you don't try to begin with. And I have like a FOIL template in my Google Docs where all I have to do is like type in like the little graph of like the actual information I'm seeking. So it's not that heavy of a load when you have a template that you just need to plug stuff into. But with that being said, I think you try to just cast as wide of a net as possible and send out as many foils as your heart desires, knowing that like 90% of them will probably not come back until you're decades older. But you'll get back one or two, and maybe those will be fruitful. But I think a good rule of thumb is like try to file a couple foils a week or a month of just things that you're interested in, bits that you've heard along the way. And, you sort of forget about them. And then a couple of months or years later, you're like, oh, I finally got a request for this thing. This is nice. It's like a little Christmas morning. So I think, as discouraging as it might be, there's also some bright spots along the way and like surprises that you never anticipated.
And also, if you're a beat reporter, when they reject the foil, you sort of get a story out of it, because you could say, oh, look, the state DMV does not want you to know how well it enforces driver suspension law. I mean, that's a good little story. And then if they reject your appeal, you get to do that story again. And eventually somebody's going to have to answer to that. Like maybe you'll be at a press conference with the governor and you can ask him that, so it's not bad.
Have you found that those types of stories can sometimes like maybe put a little pressure to get an answer eventually, or not really?
Yeah, we were really keen on knowing what percentage of NYPD officers live in the suburbs. The Village Voice had done a story like 15 years ago about that with I don't know where they got those numbers from, but we were very keen on getting those numbers. And the NYPD required us to foil it. We foiled it. They rejected our foil. We appealed it. They rejected our appeal. And finally, I said to the mayor at a press conference, what percentage of cops live in the suburbs? And he was like, oh, well, you know, I think it's a minority of cops. We'll get you that information. And by the end of the day, I had that information. So I have no idea why they could just suddenly turn it up. Turns out it was a majority of officers live in the suburbs. Just for the record, a majority of NYPD officers live in the suburbs, and that's not even counting Staten Island.
Anyone else have any tips for, like, before you even decide to get a records request? Like, what are there things that you try before you get to the FOIL point that you find the most useful? It sounds like we've talked about some of this, like obviously going to the press office, bugging them to no end, maybe bringing in information that you got from another agency or another level of government. Are there things that you absolutely try to do before you actually go to the step of doing a records request?
Records requests are fairly simple. I just know there won't usually be a quick response. That makes sense. So it's like you file it as the insurance policy, and then you proceed to do your best reporting out whatever story you're trying to get at for the 6 months or a year or 18 months or however long it actually takes for the documents to come back, you know, until you get, as Josepha said, is, you know, like you get that little Christmas present, right? It's like, oh, hey, this bundle of things that tell me what, you know, that affirm everything we've already published, but now it's in paper on, you know, city letterhead, and now we can go, you know, write it all over again. But yeah, I think, you know, I don't think people should shy away from it as being part of the reporting process. You should do it fairly early on if you're interested in something, but you should never, you know, tell an editor, oh, well, you know, I'm working on a story, I foiled it, because that's one doesn't equal the other in anything approaching a reasonable period of time. It should in a perfect world, but it doesn't.
Great. Oh yeah.
Sorry. The one thing I would add is there are times when people want to give you things, like they want someone to ask them for it. And, you know, they don't know. It's not like they know who they want to give it to. Sometimes they do, but sometimes it's just like, if you're listening, you know, and you're having a conversation with a source and they talk about something and they mention it, sometimes, you know, they'll tell you, you know, if you foil this, or they'll, you know, describe the records. Like, you know, generally speaking, FOIL is an arduous process in terms of getting results, not filing necessarily, but getting everything you need. But there are plenty of times when someone is sort of waiting for someone to foil it, because they want it. They want someone to know. They want the story to be out there. And there's no real reason for it to be out there without someone foiling for it. But, you know, so I would say just listen for those. They don't come often, but when they do, like, seize the moment.
This is a footnote to that. It doesn't always mean they're going to give you the information on the FOIL anyway, because the person who wants it out doesn't necessarily, you know, there's some information that they would love to get out there, but they know it's going to shame another agency in the same government, so they're reluctant to actually give it up. We've had that a couple of times too.
Great. We have a question from the audience. They are wondering, the previous panel, we talked to some folks who work really in kind of the legal world, and they were saying that it's very hard to kind of move forward, and that success for a lot of times with FOILs is bringing a lawsuit, right? You're getting rejected and turned down over and over again. We got to take them to court over it. Do any of you have any experience with that? Obviously, lawsuits are really like time consuming, they cost money. Can anyone speak on pursuing it in court as opposed to sort of just appealing?
Well, you only have so many appeals, right? Like, you write a FOIL, they reject it. I write the very cranky appeal, they reject it. I get the lawyers and put it on, you know, the letterhead. And then at that point, they sort of know that it's heading towards being a legal consideration. And sometimes that'll shake it loose and sometimes it won't. But generally, if they deny the appeal, the next step is to basically threaten legal action. And that's, you know, an appeal to a denied appeal, you know, it doesn't really yield anything in my experience.
Anyone else?
Sometimes the threats work. Sometimes you do, like, just getting the lawyers involved shakes it loose.
So the letterhead sometimes can be enough of a.
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah. So it's you know, obviously the Post is very blessed in terms of we're owned by a giant corporation, which has its own counsel, which also has a lot of outside legal counsel. So we have a significant advantage, to when we, like if the Post puts it on letterhead and if it's signed by, the, News Corp attorneys and then, the News Corp's private retained counsel or whatever, like it's just one of those things where it's sort of like they know we're not going away and they know we want it. And it's like we can either do this in court and it'll take 2 years. And once you actually get a FOIL to court, the law is generally on the side of the requester in a lot of cases. And, there are provisions by which legal fees are eventually covered. Although there's a lot of money sort of shelled out up front before that happens. But, the agencies also know that, like, if a news organization sues, someone's going to notice, it's going to become a story. Like it kicks a lot of things into gear where people who are denying the FOILs or sort of, wherever it's being denied in the organization, like legal action is threatened and it elevates things about 5 levels. And, it really does work sometimes. We've sued once, I've sued once and we won. It settled and got the records that we wanted. But yeah, I mean, oftentimes just getting the lawyers involved really does, really does do the trick. And unfortunately, we have a records law that is basically constructed a schema where news organizations that can't afford to get legal counsel can sort of wage those legal battles, can get a lot of those records, whereas, independent journalists or freelancers or people who work in much smaller newsrooms don't have similar resources at their hand.
That's a great point. And on the idea of fees, there's obviously the legal fees when you're kind of reaching that point, but have any of you ever gotten really exorbitant FOIL request fees? Like they're saying it's going to cost you this much to get these particular records. I know they charge sometimes per page. Has anyone ever had like a really shocking price tag? And if so, how did you kind of get around that, or what was your response?
It hasn't happened as recently. That used to be a thing. Like
when it was paper, I guess.
Yeah, they used to make you do that. I mean, the fact that the scenario that Nolan just described, with appeals and lawyers, and it sort of it's what I said before about like we need someone to actually break this system, because this isn't Governor Cuomo we're foiling. We're foiling for information from the guy we hired to run the state. Like we the public hired this guy to run the state, and now he needs to report back to us. That's the attitude that the public needs, how the public needs to be treated by the FOIA law, and it's not. It's the other way around. It's the government's information to dole out as it sees fit. I mean, most of the time we get these FOILs, half of it's redacted anyway. Now, some of it obviously should be redacted if it's someone's identity or whatever, but it doesn't mean you can just redact everything.
And on the idea of like what you would like to see changed, what kind of hope is there, and what do you think is going to happen? I know we said like maybe it's just going to take a mayor or a governor or somebody in charge who's going to kind of really overhaul the system. Are there any other things that you think? I know some lawmakers have proposed bills that could potentially reform New York's FOIA laws and potentially improve things. Are there things that you guys would like to see that you think could maybe sort of change, how difficult this whole process is for us here in New York?
I'd like to see FOIL offices actually funded, so there isn't just one FOIL lawyer for the State Department of Health. That would, I think, speed along the process a lot more if it wasn't just one person or 2 people cranking through hundreds of requests. But New York also has this really interesting thing where the legislature is not subject to FOIL. So while we can make these requests of the governor's office, of the mayor, we can't make the same request for an assembly member, a state senator, because they're just not subject to it. So while lawmakers can sit there and pontificate about the Cuomo administration should be releasing this, this, and that, they don't have to abide by those same rules. They're exempt from them. And I think that's a really fascinating dynamic that anytime they start applying pressure on the governor's office to release information, the governor's office retorts, okay, you guys should open yourself up to FOIL. And everyone's like, never mind, everything's fine, which is really, I don't know what other states do that. But it does go to show that like New York's FOIA laws have lots of nooks and crannies that people can hide behind and things can hide behind. So I just like to see more funding for FOIA offices everywhere, but also having the legislature, take on some of that responsibility themselves.
Yeah, that would be a huge help. Another thing that I think would help would be sort of a whether it's at the city level or the state level, a non sort of judicial adjudicator in these fights. In a lot of states, maybe it's the attorney general or whatever, but there is an entity that can order a recalcitrant agency to release the records, and then it's the onus is on the agency to basically sue, the requester, or to sue the state attorney general to sort of win a court order to preserve, sort of the redactions or to hang on to the records. So it flips all the onus of the court fight and it puts it on the agency seeking to withhold instead of putting it on the requester. And I think that would be a huge, I don't know if it's the state attorney general here, I don't know if it's the state comptroller, the city comptroller, the state comptroller, or the public advocate or whatever, but just to have some entity outside of the traditional executive bureaucracy that can say, no, really turn them over, without having to go through the expense and sort of the circus of going to court, would make it markedly better.
Great. We also had a question from the audience who is curious, and maybe those of you who've worked with state government could speak on this a little bit, about your experiences with the New York State Committee on Open Government in the post-Bob Freeman era. So Bob Freeman left a few years ago. What do anyone have any thoughts to share on that? That's something that somebody sent a question in. Any experiences with the New York State Committee on Open Government? No.
I've never had any interaction with that ever.
Fair enough. Well, I guess a question I'll throw out there, as we're going to wrap up in the next couple of minutes. If there was one thing that you wish you had known before you filed your first records request, like maybe back, in your early years, that you now know, what's something maybe that you would tell maybe a newbie who has never done this before? Is there something that was sort of a game changer for you, or something to keep in mind that you kind of wish that you had known when you started out reporting with open records that you know now after having filed a lot of these and gone through this process so many times?
I have two quick ones.
Great.
One is slow down, because sometimes you think of an idea, I got to get that document. And then you slow it down for a second and think, okay, how is this document how would it be characterized by the people who are trying to hide it from me? Like saying, I asked for license suspensions and they've got a different way of describing it. So that's one. And then the other is to try to think like the people who create these documents. In other words, every piece of information you want is not necessarily in a document. The Freedom of Information Law only covers records. Sometimes there's not a record unless you phrase it the right way. And I think the phrase, and that's what I mean, slow down, think about what the record is you're looking for rather than just the idea. I think I don't know, other people have a much more eloquent way of saying that, but that's what I've been experiencing more recently.
Really spending some time on hammering down the specifics, it sounds like, other than just throwing things out there and hoping something will stick to the wall.
Right.
Yeah. Anyone else?
I think for me, it's talking to a lot of people before you file that request, so you know what you're looking for, at least have an idea. But also keeping a spreadsheet for yourself. I wish someone taught me this in college, of the date you made the request, the date you got the acknowledgement, the date it's supposed to be fulfilled, a sort of snippet of or descriptor of what records you requested, and then how the dates of when the extension came, so you can start keeping track of what information you've asked for when. And then at some point that becomes its own story of they're stonewalling you, or the Cuomo administration or whoever administration is bad with oil. But I think trying to keep track of all this stuff really meticulously, because it can get cumbersome. And after, a couple months and a few different extensions, you sort of start forgetting about it. So keeping a very detailed Excel sheet for yourself, I think, is very helpful.
I think that's my number one FOIL problem, is that I forget about them. And then I'm like, oh man, I missed the time that I was supposed to respond to that. So I think that that's a really good idea. Probably set some alerts maybe on your calendar. Anyone else, Bridget or Nolan, thoughts and tips that you wish you'd known starting out that you now know after having done this for a while?
I think, Joseph has said it before. The process of filing a FOIL itself is not particularly difficult, but if that is sort of the first hurdle for you, there are a lot of resources that are out there. If you look at IRE, they have the investigative reporters. I can't remember what the E stands for.
Editors, I think.
Editors, right? Investigative reporters and editors. They have a whole library of sample FOILs. Talk to people in your newsroom who do file more FOILs and look at samples. One of the things that I thought was fun was when the New York Post and New York One sued the de Blasio administration for all the communications with the so-called agents of the city. Those you got to see these really well-written FOIL requests, and of course also the contents of what they were foiling as part of that lawsuit. And so, even if you are maybe struggling to figure out how to craft your own request, there are opportunities to look for guidance in what other people have done. And why start from scratch if someone's already started to sort of chip away at it? So that would be my suggestion.
And the spreadsheet is an amazing idea, as is trying to learn. I mean, that's how I learned. I learned because other reporters taught me. And I think sort of the other big lesson that I learned, I had a boss when I was at the San Antonio paper, Greg Jefferson, who wouldn't let me write a FOIL request, or the Texas version of FOIL, for 3 months, because he wanted to teach me how to use a telephone to report out a story instead of just depending on records all the time. And that really taught me that there is a lot that people, everything in a document has been put in a document by a human, right? Someone has some general idea. And if it's a pretty big problem, there are probably a bunch of people who kind of sort of know what there is a lot that people already know. You just have to find those people, and those people can be activists who are probably keeping their own records. I remember when I was at the Daily News, we consistently tried to get a list of people who were killed and officer-involved fatalities. The PD sent it down the black hole to the surprise of no one. But there were activist organizations who've been keeping track of this stuff. And so Sarah Riley and I managed to talk them into them sharing their lists with us. We took those lists, matched it up against all the, the archives, the Daily News and the Post and the Times, and put together our own list of here are the 100 and whatever it was. 180, 190, sort of we vetted over 15 years. We pulled all the stories and sort of, but that was already kind of public, right? Because basically all those cases are in newspaper archives, right? If you're trying to figure out who owns what in New York, a lot of that's already public through ACRIS. A lot of it, if you're trying to figure out where a bad guy is, with his shell companies that he's moving money through, a lot of that's in campaign finance records, as unusable as they are right now, thank you to the State Board of Elections. But there is a wealth of information that is already publicly available. And there is a universe of people who probably have some idea of what's going on. And I think sort of the thing I learned sort of the hard way is that a FOIL is the 5th bite or the 6th bite or the 7th bite at a story a lot of times, right? And that you can do a lot of the legwork leading up to the FOIL, or getting the editors interested in fighting for the FOIL, just by talking to sources, putting human faces on stories, and using what's already sort of publicly available, a big city contractor. Well, how much do they have in contracts? Well, that's public, through checkbook. So, and it's just to like use those resources and not just say, well, it's public, everybody's already looked there, because I mean, the really depressing thing is there aren't that many of us left, and there is a lot of public stuff out there, and we don't have the ability to check it all. So you'll just flipping over a rock that's there, you'll find something.
Great advice. Well, that was so great. Thank you all so much for sharing your insights and for sharing these interesting stories. I'll turn it back to George, but I appreciate you guys sharing this with us. It's really interesting.
Thanks so much, Jeanmarie, and thank you so much, everyone. Jeanmarie, thank you so much for your moderating excellence tonight, as well as to all of our panelists for such great insight. We will make this panel available to you on demand on our website, so keep up with all that the Deadline Club has to offer at deadlineclub.org, and be sure to follow us on social media as well. I'm George Bolarkey. Again, thank you, everyone, so much. Everyone have a great evening. Take care now.
Thank you.